From Thom Hartmann's Daily Take Substack. Dear MAGA, you stormed the Capitol for a guy who couldn't even storm out of Epstein's pedo pool party. You screamed, quote, fake news, end quote, while the real news was your chosen savior sipping cocktails at Epstein's mansion, selling out your future, and laughing at what an easy sucker you were. Published July 24th, 2025. The following is a song inspired by this article.
Dear MAGA, you raised your fist so high, screaming justice as the tear gas filled the sky. You wore your cap, stood proud in that hall, while your Messiah hid behind gold-plated walls. He told you he'd save the kids in chains, but he flew first class to Epstein's planes. While you feared basements that don't exist, he was soaking in spaz with a teenage guest list. You stormed the Capitol for a man who knew damn well where those jet wheels ran. He said, protect the girls from evil's hand, then drank with the monster on his private land. You believed he'd end the child abuse, but he was toasting with the ones who cut them loose. He told you lies with a wink and grin, while girls, not yet women, were trafficked in. He said, Democrats worship Satan's plan, while shaking hands with that pedophile's clan. You gave up your job, your name, your fate, for a con man in gold behind Mar-a-Lago's gate. Now you're in jail for that big red wave, while he's out golfing, dodging graves. You stormed the Capitol for a fraud who watched as children were beaten and pawed. He promised you fire, he promised revenge, but he swam with devils in Epstein's den. You fought for the lie while the truth lay bare, that your hero didn't care, was never there. They weren't actors or pawns in a meme. They were girls 14, 15, stolen from dreams. While you spun tales of basements below, the real horror was filmed in mansions aglow. He said, I alone can fix this land, and signed away your rights with a trembling hand. He gutted your future, slashed your pay, while young girls wept just a flight away. He laughed with Epstein, shared the jet, but he knew you'd forget he'd cash in that bet. Now you're the joke he tells at night, the mark who mistook delusion for fight. You stormed the Capitol for a guy who let girls suffer while selling a lie. He told you he'd save them, then walked away as they cried for help at the end of the day. Dear MAGA, you gave him your soul and breath, but your king was dining in the house of death. And now, dear MAGA, the truth is clear. You were never the hero, just the volunteer for a man who saw pain and walked on past, while the girls you swore to save never made it back.
Well, now we and all MAGA land have discovered that Donald Trump and all the senior law enforcement officials around him have known ever since May that his name is in multiple places in the Epstein documents, at least according to the Wall Street Journal. That would almost certainly include the senior law enforcement officer Todd Blanche, who was on his way to interview Ghislaine Maxwell in prison. Totally without bias, of course. No way the guy was Trump's personal criminal defense attorney is going to try to get Maxwell to point the finger at Bill Clinton and away from Donald Trump. Right? Right? Donald Trump and Jeff Epstein were apparently storming teenagers while MAGA followers were storming the Capitol. It's a tough time for the true believers, and that may signal a real opportunity for us in the reality-based world to wake up some of our brothers and sisters in MAGA land. Recently, one of the Trump-following MAGA faithful called into my radio TV program about Epstein. He'd called in before, usually spouting some random right-wing talking points as if it would instantly win him an argument. The strategy usually doesn't work well for him, but he keeps on trying. This time, though, the topic was Epstein, and he seemed lost. All he could do was dismissively call me, quote, Tommy, end quote, and, quote, liar, end quote. He sputtered a bit and then hung up before I could say more than, quote, you're on the air, end quote. Increasingly, as Van Morrison sings in his song, Brand New Day, MAGA cultists are saying out loud, quote, I was lost, double-crossed, end quote, by Trump. They believed him when he was campaigning in October 2020 and was asked in an NBC town hall about QAnon. Quote, what do you think about their theory that Democrats are a satanic pedophile ring and that you are the savior of that, end quote. He replied, quote, let me just tell you, what I do hear about it is they are very strongly against pedophilia, and I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that, and I agree with it very strongly, end quote. In other words, Trump suggested, yes, there is an international ring of rich and powerful men running pedophile rings, and they're associated with the Democratic Party and Democrats more generally. Now that it's come out that there was, in fact, a major pedophile ring whose members abused, exploited, and raped over 1,000 girls and young women, and for more than a decade, Trump was right there in the middle of it, a ring run by his, quote, best friend, end quote, Jeffrey Epstein, MAGA followers are reeling from the cognitive dissonance. If you are one of those Trump followers, or pass this note along to somebody who is, here's, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. Dear MAGA follower, Trump didn't just nakedly lie to you when he promised that he'd smash the pedo rings and, quote, drain the swamp, end quote. He's been lying to you his entire political career. He lied to you when he told you that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. That lie was promoted by billionaire-owned media like Fox, quote, News, end quote, that wanted Trump in office. Why? So he could do favors for the morbidly rich who give him money. He lied to you when he said that he supported blue-collar workers. In fact, Trump appointed a professional union buster, Eugene Scalia, as labor secretary in his last term, and his current labor secretary, Lori Chavez DeRimer, went so far as to brag to Republican senators that she, quote, fully, end quote, supports virulently anti-work, quote, anti-union, quote, right to work for less, end quote, laws that have gutted union membership since the Reagan Revolution. Why? Because billionaires who give Republican money hate unions. He lied to you when he said he'd clean up the environment. Instead, he's dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency, has shut down their Scientific Office of Research and Development, fired thousands of employees and scientists, and have rolled back over 100 rules that protect our air, water, and soil. Why? Because the fossil fuel industry and big polluters give him money. He lied to you when he said he wanted a good future for your children. Here in the reality-based world, Trump killed Biden's efforts to reduce student loan debt, is pushing programs to defund public schools, and has all but shut down the entire federal Department of Education. Why? Because the private school industry gives him money. He lied to you when he said he'd lower health care costs because his and the GOP's massive cuts to Medicaid and his deregulation efforts, giant insurance companies that administer Affordable Care Act policies, are rolling out rate increases as much as 75% for next year. Why? Because the giant insurance companies give them money. He lied to you when he said he'd protect Social Security. Instead, he's laid off 7,000 Social Security workers, causing absolute chaos in the agency and hours-long, sometimes days-long telephone rates for help or to sign up for new benefits. Why? Because the big banks, which want to take over Social Security, give him money. He lied to you when he said he'd bring home manufacturing jobs. Instead, his erratic tariff policies have discouraged American companies from building facilities here because they can't rely on the tariffs being around like they would be if, like the Constitution says, they were imposed by Congress instead of the president. Because of his freezing Biden's Inflation Reduction Act funds for helping entrepreneurs with new factories, many are shutting down, leading to a loss of over 100,000 manufacturing jobs since his inauguration. Why? Because illegally wielding tariffs gives him a sense of power and forces other nations' leaders to come groveling to him with flattery worthy of Idi Amin and billion-dollar bribes for himself, his company, and his family. He lied to you when he said he'd lower the cost of groceries. Instead, he's pushing for more monopolies in the grocery sector. His tariffs are driving up prices, and his refusal to do anything about climate change is making crop yields continue to collapse, driving up the produce, meat, and egg prices. Why? Because tariffs give him power and bribes, and the fossil fuel industry gives him money. He lied to you when he said he'd lower the cost of housing. Instead, he's gutting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, letting rip-off mortgage lenders who are having a field day. Why? Because the banking industry gives him money. He lied to you when he said he'd give working-class people a tax cut. Instead, virtually all of the new tax cuts from the big ugly bill go to the top 1% of Americans, and in 2 years, taxes will go up on working class people. And he gutted the IRS so they can no longer effectively audit morbidly rich people. Why? Because he's a billionaire. 13 of his cabinet members are billionaires, and his buddies, like Epstein, are billionaires. And none of them, particularly Trump, want to pay their damn taxes. He lied to you when he said, quote, I'd eliminate the federal debt, end quote. Instead, Trump has added more to the federal debt faster than any president in the last 249-year-long history of the United States. Why? He's forcing our government to borrow money our children must pay back in order to give that cash to himself and his billionaire buddies. He lied to you when he said, quote, we're going to rebuild America, end quote, with a, quote, $1 trillion infrastructure bill, end quote. Instead, he not only never offered such legislation, but is actively kneecapping the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that Democrats passed during Biden's presidency. Why? Because billionaires hate paying taxes for things that benefit the, quote, little people, end quote, who need roads and bridges while they live on their estates and travel by private jet. He lied to you when he said he was only going to arrest undocumented immigrants who committed crimes and were the, quote, worst of the worst, end quote. Instead, over 70% of the people ICE has arrested in recent months have had spotless records in the United States, and many were already approved for asylum or other statuses that allowed them to stay in the U.S. or even work to become citizens. Why? Because he's a racist, and has been ever since he was a kid when the feds busted him for writing a big, quote, C, end quote, on, quote, colored, end quote, people's rental applications for his father's apartment so they could be turned down. The list goes on. Trump said he'd protect voting rights, and instead is trying to make it harder for women and minorities to vote. He said he'd protect women's rights, and instead women in red states are bleeding out in unprecedented numbers. He said he'd protect our democracy, but instead is taking an axe to it. He said he'd respect law, but has taken bribes that violate the Hatch Act since taking office. He said that he'd protect veterans, and instead is gutting the VA. He said he'd respect police, but instead led a charge against them that killed 3 officers. Why all the lies? Because he's a compulsive liar, and he found advantage either politically or financially in each of his lies. He thinks of you, dear MAGA, the same way he thinks of the people who patronized his university, bought products from his failed businesses, and paid the absurd fees to join his seedy golf motel clubs. All of you are, in his mind, suckers. So, dear MAGA, please reconsider your slavish devotion to this lifelong liar, convicted felon, and adjudicated sexual assaulter, and join the rest of us in the real world. You've been lied to for too long, and we're here to help with your re-entry into normal civil society.